Good evening, everyone. My name is Kevin Brockbank. I'm the president here at Spokane Community College, and it's my sincere pleasure to be able to welcome all of you this evening to this event on behalf of our faculty, staff, and students at SCC. We're, I think, really fortunate to, for the second time today, be able to welcome our speaker, Kevin Young, and be able to let him share some of his experiences and thoughts and readings as part of this speaker series. We had a great conversation this morning. I know you'll be entertained by this if it's anything like the conversation Dean Cash James had this morning. So on behalf of all of our executive college leadership, I want to emphasize the importance of these types of events at SCC. We realize it's important for all of us to further educate ourselves, become better informed, look at things through different perspectives in order for us to help develop a fully equitable campus for all of our SCC students. So thanks for being an active participant today and helping us move SCC forward. And with that, I will turn it over to Dean Cash James for a formal introduction of our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Brockbank. On behalf of Spokane Community College and the Hagen Center for the Humanities, I would like to welcome all of you to our Diversity Dialogues. With the words, I see you, I hear you, I feel you, we welcome you collectively and figuratively to sit down together, all of us at the same table, and to engage in dialogue about race, about diversity, and about equity. We encourage audience participation. So if you would like to ask questions of our guests this evening, please type them into the comments, or if you're not logged into social media, you can email your questions to scc.hagencenter@scc.spokane.edu. And one more time, that's scc.hagencenter, and Hagen is spelled Hagan, @scc.spokane.edu. Our moderators will forward those questions to me, and I will make sure we get to ask our guest as many of those questions as we can. It's my pleasure today to introduce Kevin Young. He's the director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the poetry editor of The New Yorker, where he also hosts the Poetry Podcast. He previously served as the director of the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. He is the author of 13 books of poetry and prose, most recently Brown, which was featured on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. Blue Laws, Selected and Uncollected Poems, longlisted for the National Book Award, and The Book of Hours, a finalist for the Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award and winner of the Lenore Marshall Prize for Poetry from the Academy of American Poets. His collection Jelly Roll, A Blues, was a finalist for both the National Book Award and the Los Angeles Times Book Award. Young's second nonfiction book, Bunk, The Rise of Hoaxes, Humbug, Plagiarists, Phonies, Post-Facts, and Fake News, won the Anisfield Wolf Book Award in nonfiction, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Penn Gene Stein Book Award, was longlisted for the National Book Award, and was named a New York Times notable book. He is the editor of 9 other collections, including the anthology African American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song from Library of America, which the New York Times Book Review, Esquire, Time, The Atlantic, Good Morning America, O, the Oprah Magazine, Chicago Tribune, Shelf Awareness, LitHub, and Barnes & Noble named one of the best books of 2020. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and was named a chancellor of the Academy of American Poets in 2020. Thank you so much, Kevin, for being with us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. And in our conversation just a few minutes ago, you mentioned that maybe you'd just like to start with a poem this evening.
Oh, yeah. I thought I'd read a couple. I wouldn't say they're older poems, but they're poems that I think give a sense of some of the things we ended up talking about today, music and meaning, rapture. I want to be awake when the world ends. I want to be my friend who rose to an empty house, even his grandmother and her worn cross gone, and thought it was the rapture that he hadn't crossed over. Let me rip my shirt and as he did and tear into the street hollering. Let me hear only my blood beat this morning in the rain before the dawn, no one on the line. Later, when they return, let those I love who left have only gone to the store, running errands, this errant, unebbing life. After, let what I've torn, the myself I mourn, be mended and start over like a scar or star. rapture.
Thank you. I can collectively hear on Zoom people, rubbing their hands and doing that sound people do at a poetry reading of feeling good. That was wonderful. Earlier today, when you and I chatted, you mentioned that you felt called to poetry.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that call and how it shaped your path to where you're at today?
Well, I think it happened in different ways. I mean, for me, I was always writing down little stories and drawing little cartoons and things like that. And I would sit down to write a story, and I would imagine like a giant trilogy. I watched Star Wars. I loved kind of those kind of big imaginary things. And then I'd sit down and I'd get a page in, and I'd start fussing over every word. And I realized I had sort of a poet's temperament. I mean, maybe it was impatience too. But I was pretty young, 12 or 13, and I felt like, there's something about poetry that I read then that was really exciting. A quick story that I took a summer class just at the local university, and we wrote stories. It was creative writing. We wrote stories and poems and things like that. But he gave us an assignment, the teacher, I'm still friends with to this day. And he gave us an assignment where we had to write a poem based on something. In my case, I think it was a book on Egypt. And he always threatens to publish this poem I wrote someday. And I'm like, please, it needs to never be seen again. But it was sort of my first poem, really. And what I loved about it is I handed it in, and what he would do is have poems he liked and stories he liked typed up in the department on a Mimeo machine, with the purple print, if you remember that, and they smelled kind of good. And he'd hand them out, but without your name. And there was something about that, not having my name on it and seeing my little poem that like thrilled me. And it was kind of this secret thrill. In a way, that's what poetry became for me, this way to kind of communicate to a world that may or may not know who I was. And I took it probably more seriously than anyone might have thought, but he was kind enough, his name is Tom Averill, Thomas Fox Averill, he's a writer, to take me seriously enough to encourage me in different ways. And then I didn't need much encouragement in a way, I just started writing and writing. But the thing that really turned me from writing poems about abstract things and love and pain and the sort of generalized things was really thinking about my family and my family in Louisiana. And I'm sure some of it was going away to college where I was far from that. Some of the things that I assumed that everyone had pepper vinegar in their fridge, and like we hardly used jelly or jam. We ate like preserved figs that grew on my grandparents' tree. They were farmers in Louisiana. So there was a way in which I thought that was just kind of how everyone was. And then getting to school, I really realized, oh, it's a different world out there. And it was a way to kind of connect to that, just in a personal way. But I think in a larger way, it meant seeing that poetry was about the everyday stuff. It was about the dirt and figs and what you could grow with your hands. And poetry, in fact, was made with your hands, and it was organic and had, it smelled of soil and the earth. And that was the point of poetry. And I think I had before then, though I was writing it, thought of it as an abstract thing. And I think we do better when we realize it's more about our everyday lives. It's about our backyard. And the great poets, I think, many of them, I hope, are in this anthology of African-American poetry I edited. Langston Hughes, Gwendolyn Brooks, Lucille Clifton, Sonia Sanchez. These are poets who write about what's around us, what they see, but also what isn't always said. And Lucille Clifton has a great way of describing poetry where she says, poetry is meant to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And that kind of combination, I think, is one that kept me in poetry and writing after I started.
How old did you say you were when you wrote that first poem?
I think it was 12 or 13. Okay. Like I said, I've forbidden him to show it to anyone so we can find confirmation. But, in a weird way, I really am thankful for those, not even in a weird way, just plainly speaking. I took a class, I did this, I was able to do like a summer thing. These were, I felt, things in Kansas that were, where I was at the time, were rare, but they existed and were sort of wonderful. And that kind of stuff, I don't know where you turn now if you're a younger writer, that there wasn't that kind of community that I had even if it was, looking back on it, us just writing to each other. And I think you find your community where you are. And later, I found in writers collectives I was in and groups I was in and with friends, that same kind of community that builds writers.
How have your, we'll call them poetic preoccupations changed since you first began writing?
Oh, they've become very sophisticated. And no, I mean, of course, they're like the same. One's obsessions are, I used to write about food and hair, but maybe there's less hair now. I don't know. It's like you have the same kind of things. But I think stepping back, most poets do think about the big things and they find out a way to write about them. Love, death, pain and pleasure, joy and acceptance, loss and love, all those things that shape us and that I think have become all the more heightened this past year, and so in a way, as I was saying this afternoon, I think poetry is really built for this moment, built for a moment to talk in nuanced fashion about the language and experience around us. And I think sometimes people think of poetry as the right word or perfect or something. And I think of it as, being able to represent the loss of language, the inability to always say right. And poetry sort of is tiptoeing toward it. And there's nothing like a poem that enacts that feeling of loss. And then at the end, sort of you share it, because what a poem does is transports you for the moment of the lyric poem. And I like to say maybe a few beats after, you are someone else. You are that other I, whether it's Hughes or Brooks or Hughes is writing in the voice of a washerwoman or the Negro who speaks of rivers, you are that I for a moment. And there's echoes that happen from that. And that I and that echo are so much part of the lyric moment. So I could evangelize about poetry all day. So, I'll stop there. But, I think it's important to say what poetry does that's specific and unique to it in a world where we have many other forms available to us.
I would listen to you evangelize about poetry.
Well, you don't have a choice for the next 45 minutes, hour.
Yes. So I do want to hear, and I know our audience would like to hear a little bit about your work as an editor. So tell us a little bit about the origins of the Poetry Podcast.
Oh, well, it's something I inherited. The New Yorker, I think, has been really smart and really good about providing extra things and realizing the magazine was bigger than just the print magazine, but that it was rooted in the print magazine. I think both things are important. And so what we do in the podcast is we ask poets who've appeared in the magazine to look through their archives. So they can go as far back as 1925 and see what there is to see and share it with us. When I did the podcast long before I was poetry editor, I picked a John Berryman poem, a poet I admired, but also, is kind of confusing at times and difficult, but also really interesting. And it was a poem about his son being born. And I had written poems that the New Yorker took about mine being born. So there was that, but also his son was named Paul, which was my late father's name. So there was this weird kind of connection. I say all that to say, it's about connecting the podcast and connecting the past to the present of the poets. And hopefully the poets and I also, some I know well, and some I'm getting to know, some poems they pick I've known, and some I had even picked, but some I'm just experiencing for the first time. So there's always this element of discovery, and I hope it's there for the listeners too.
You've mentioned this wonderful, I think of them as poetry parents maybe, but Berryman, Lucille Clifton,
Sure.
Sonia Sanchez, you've talked about, again, these icons of poetry, and you yourself as someone recently elected as a chancellor. How do you see yourself in that role right now?
That's a great question. What I love about those poets that I'm with thinking about poetry is how serious they take it all, and how, people like Terrence Hayes or Elizabeth Alexander, Forrest Gander, all of whom I've known a long time, are just so happens in different ways, are, really thinking about poetry, really thinking about their own poetry, but also poetry, big P poetry. And the poets I really admire are ones who are in service not just to their own poetry, but to big P poetry. And I think that's important. I have a couple friends who've been poets laureate, and what they've been able to do, I think, has made an impact and helped to get us to this moment, which I hope we're in, where people don't see poetry as some foreign object. Poetry used to be in the newspaper. People would write little verse, and it wasn't. It was holy, but it wasn't sacred, or maybe it's the other way around. There was a way in which ordinary people, quote unquote, could write poetry, and it wasn't threatening to the idea of poetry. And William Matthews has this great poem where he talks about like people, he talks about showing a poem of his to Charles Mingus, the famous, amazing bassist. And Mingus sort of saying, there's a lot of that going around, he said, but he doesn't think it was dangerous to poetry. Like people who think, it's as if people think that Little League should be banned or they'll destroy Major League Baseball. He says it more poetically than I am. But the point is that there is a way in which we need to have poetry demystified a bit. And at the same time, recognize that really good poetry requires dedication and a little bit of inspiration and luck, but a lot of work. The great poets, say Louise Glick, who won the Nobel Prize, are writing poetry all the time. And they don't just write one good poem, they write a lot of poems that I think about the world in a big way. And that's what more of my evangelizing, but I love the place that poetry can become, largely because of the poets I know who are dedicated to poetry in the biggest sense.
So when you set out the task for yourself of editing the recent anthology, African American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song, what were the stories you found yourself wanting to tell as you chose and arranged poems in that anthology? And maybe also you could talk a little bit about how you made choices about what you couldn't include.
Yeah, I mean, the couple things I couldn't include, I realized pretty early on I couldn't include like song lyrics, which was sad to me. I mean, I think the blues are a poetic form. And so that was an early decision, just for space reasons. And similarly, I couldn't include poetry that was written mainly for children, of which there's a rich history. And that was harder than you think, just because all of the poets, Lucille Clifton, Langston Hughes, also wrote poems for children. And some of them are some of my favorites, but I really wanted to stick to this other stream of work. At the same time, I want to think a lot about, and I said this earlier today, what it means to be African American, what it means to be American, what poetry is. So there's prose poems by poets starting in the 19 teens. One of my favorite poets named Fenton Johnson, who's writing these really modernist, blues-infused prose poems. I mean, who could not like that, And then people who are writing as early as the 19th century in other languages. The first anthology of African-American verse is called Les Sennelles. It's from 1845, done by Creole poets in Louisiana, where my family's from. So they were originally in French, but Langston Hughes translated them. Other poets have returned to them. So they're part of the tradition. They weren't just these outliers, but they're not often thought of. And in fact, most anthologies ignore them completely. So I really wanted to put them in. So I want to have these conversations about the language of poetry. What is poetry? Is it prose poetry? Yes. Is it concrete poetry? Yes. Is it in different languages? What's American? What's African American? That was really important. And I think the result is there's this ongoing conversation between poets across borders, even. There's some Caribbean poets who are often included in such anthologies, Claude McKay, for instance, Derek Walcott. They spent a lot of time in the States. So there was a way that, that was part of the tradition, but also trying to break new ground. So I think a good anthology is trying to do something like that, which is think about the tradition, but cut it in different ways. And I think it's a little like a gumbo or something. You got to make it taste good. It can't, it has a lot of different sources, but it has to kind of coalesce into something its own. See, food. I told you food in here.
I have not heard that metaphor before for poetry as gumbo, so I'm going to tuck that one away. I like that.
Yeah.
Given our current cultural and political climate, tensions, just a challenging moment in history in so many ways. You mentioned earlier that poetry, and these are my words, not yours, it's what I took away from what you said, that the language of poetry and poetry itself really does a lot of heavy lifting, in kind of a compressed space sometimes. What do you think poetry needs to be doing in the world we're in right now? And is that sometimes kind of an unbearable responsibility as a poet?
Yeah, I'm more interested in what poetry does, than what it needs to do. I, I wrote all my manifestos when I was younger, and I do think there's things poetry does and perhaps should do at different times. But mostly, I think about what poetry does, and what I think it does is provide something different, a moment of clarity, a moment of reflecting confusion. Um, one of the poems that people have really responded to is a poem by Ada Limon called The End of Poetry. You can look it up on newyorker.com. But we published that poem, which was written before the pandemic, but is such a powerful pandemic feeling poem, and I don't think she'd be upset for me to reveal that. We talked about it on the podcast fairly recently. But one of the powerful things is that I think poetry is always prescient, and if you're in touch with, it's going to sound cheesy, the universe or some aspect of your own existence, I think you are trying to talk about existence writ large, and that reveals itself to you, but hopefully to others. And here's a poem called The End of Poetry that, of course, is talking about the future of where we're at, the moment we're at, and it's sort of about rejection. No more this, no more that, and enough of this. And I think at the end, there's this desire, I'll let you read the poem, to connect, and I think that's very much what poetry does. Is poetry isn't simply saying like, let's all get along. It's saying, I'm rejecting this, or I've seen this and you haven't, or I'm going to call out this injustice or hypocrisy or moment, or this weakness in myself, or this, thing that's happening. But I'm going to do it in language, which we all share in some way. Language can divide too. And I'm going to point out the ways that we need to make beautiful things out of it, or that I'm going to be as ugly as it is. It needn't do, one or the other. It needn't be only beautiful. As soon as you say that, then something like what Thelonious Monk called ugly beauty comes along, and you have to kind of name that. And for me, the poetry I really like isn't afraid of naming. And the blues I admire names pain in order to get past it. And that kind of quality of naming it, that's if poetry has to do anything, it's to name it. It doesn't have to provide a solution. It doesn't have to make public policy about it. It doesn't have to even make it sound beautiful. Sometimes it makes it sound like it sounds. But I think in that, just transforming it, in that naming it, it's transformative, and it's a form of witnessing in that way. And witnessing it isn't just seeing something, but saying it, and knowing you're not alone, which is what I think a poem can do, is one of its most powerful testimonies.
Do you have a poem from the anthology that you'd like to share?
Yes, I sure do. So this is a poem in a weird way about witnessing. It's not in a weird way, in a powerful way. It's by Eve L. Ewing. I want to read a poem by a younger poet. And this is a poem about seeing Emmett Till, who, as we were talking about this afternoon, was lynched in 1955, and his mother insisted his casket be open in order to show what had been done to him. So the title goes into the poem itself. I saw Emmett Till this week at the grocery store, looking over the plums one by one, lifting each to his eyes and turning it slowly, a little earth, checking the smooth skin for pockmarks and rot or signs of unkind days or people, then sliding them gently into the plastic, whistling softly, reaching with a slim woolen arm into the card. He first balanced them over the wire before realizing the danger of bruising and lifting them back out, cradling them in the crook of his elbow until something harder could take that bottom space. I knew him from his hat, one of those fine pork pie numbers they used to sell on Roosevelt Road. It had lost its feather, but he had carefully folded a dollar bill and slid it between the ribbon and the felt, and it stood at attention. He wore his money. Upright and strong, he was already to the checkout by the time I caught up with him. I called out his name, and he spun like a dancer, candy bar in hand, looked at me quizzically for a moment before remembering my face. He smiled. Well, hello, young lady. Hello. So chilly today. Should have worn my warm coat like you. Yes, so cool for August in Chicago. How are things going for you? Oh, he sighed and put the candy on the belt. It goes. It goes.
Kevin, in a poem like that, it's the intimacy of the imagery, because it's really grounded in kind of the ordinary, invites the reader to participate in an act of witnessing just as much as the poem itself bears witness to what's happening there. You know, for some of our audience, I think we struggle sometimes to think that there's this magical code that we're supposed to break in poetry in order to understand the poem. Can you talk a little bit about the ways in which you see that that particular poem invites the reader into that intimate moment of witnessing?
Well, yes. I mean, I think Eve Ewing has done a beautiful job of capturing uh, what it's like just to be in a grocery store, first of all, and that became such a fraught space this past year. I remember figuring out, before masks were all the time, like what should I wear, how should I go, what should I do, and in this poem, it's both fraught and not fraught. There's something beautiful about imagining Emmett Till living well beyond when he was able to live, and after being murdered in Mississippi, but coming from Chicago, where Eve Ewing also lives. So there's a kind of intimacy. You see that in the hat, in the dollar bill, which I think is a beautiful detail, but also kind of a little rakish in a powerful way. But there's also this bruising, this echo of what we know, and she tells us, there's not like something she's not telling us. She tells us in the title, I saw Emmett Till at the grocery store. And so the seeing isn't just though the recognition, it's also this conversation. And again, I've sort of likened poetry to this conversation. And I rather than think of it like the poem's keeping a secret from us, it's more like, let's engage the poem and talk to it and hear it talk back, hear what it's saying. Because most poems, I think, that are doing a good job aren't trying to hide it. They're saying it as clear as they possibly can. And that ending, which she allows him to have the last words, I think is very just heartbreakingly beautiful, where it goes something that people say a lot, at least in this grocery store and in this town and in this world and in the community that I feel I'm familiar with. And she manages to have that also say so much about, going away, what isn't going on, but everything that's going on. And especially reading it now, I hope we can hear the echoes of sort of, the ongoing quest for justice, the injustice that was done to him, and that even crept into our imagination. There was a kind of 50, 60 years of acting like there was something he had done that broke some code that led to his lynching. And of course, the woman who I don't even know what to say, said that he had done these, said something sassy to her, I don't know, whatever, was lying, and admitted so a couple years ago. But why did we believe even that little part of someone who murdered a kid? and helped get him murdered in a horrible way. So I think there's, it implicates us. And I think that's some of what a powerful poem can do. And we shouldn't shy away from digging into its meanings because of that feeling, which can be unsettling, right? But that's just the first layer. There's layers of pleasure that she's trying to explore, and, the everyday, like we were saying. And I think you put it well about sort of making that everydayness familiar. What would it mean to see him every day, and to see him anew? And the poem's asking us not to imagine that, but to just say it's happening.
So you are working at any given moment in just your working life, setting aside pandemic, home life, all those different things, really in three worlds at the same time, as a poet and as an editor, and then now most recently as the director of what is becoming an iconic museum. Can you tell us about your journey to becoming the director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real privilege to be in that position. It's something that, the museum itself has been, a century in the making, and then 13 long years between being finally approved, after decades of attempts, and then being built. And now we're celebrating our 5th anniversary this fall. And it's amazing how much some of the things that the museum does, I've long thought, I believe that African-American culture and history is at the center of the American story. The story that the museum tells is an American one, but it's also rooted in African-American history and culture, of course. But you can't tell American history without telling those stories, without reckoning with enslavement, without thinking about that long arc of justice, as Martin Luther King, Reverend King said. And so I think that for me, when I was writing a book like the Gray Album, 10 years ago it came out, I was really starting out writing about what was Black about American culture. And then I really, through the writing of it, came to think about, well, what's unique Black about Black culture? What makes it unique? And so the subtitle of the Gray Album is On the Blackness of Blackness, which refers to many things, including Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. But I was really trying to think about that, like what was special and its own. And some of the things I talk about there have to do with improvisation and invention and imagination, and the ways that people like Phyllis Wheatley or Frederick Douglass imagined their freedom before they experienced it. And that's really important, I think, is to recognize the ways that enslaved people created spirituals and created escape routes and ran away and resisted, both in body, but also in mind and in soul. And I was really interested in that. And of course, that's where the museum takes its start. So for me, it can, looking back, it feels like something I couldn't have hoped for, but I'm so happy that it's been the case. Just in terms of working in this field, I really started as a curator when I was at Emory University, getting collections, but not just Black collections. In fact, I was the curator of literary collections. So I worked with Irish collections and some African-American, but really poetry writ large again. And then I ran the Schomburg Center, which was a real privilege to run, one of the oldest and biggest Black archives in the world, founded in 1925. And I think that they have simpatico goals, but I also think the museum has really drawn people, I think 2 million people a year when we were open, to see that space. And if you've seen it, you know what a transformative space it is. And we talked about that a little this morning. And transformation, I think, is one of the names of the game.
For those of us who couldn't be in our talk this morning, could you just talk a little bit, for those of us who live here in Spokane and may not have had an opportunity, just about that? You talked about sort of the visual metaphor of the museum itself.
Well, what the symbol of the museum is the silhouette of the structure designed by David Ajayi, and that beautiful structure, I think, that soaring quality, which looks kind of like a crown and nestles its layers and refers to African aspects of architecture, I think is so amazing. But once you enter it, you kind of descend and you start, traditionally speaking, in the galleries of enslavement and thinking about freedom and the struggle for freedom. And that is really powerful as you ascend through the museum, through the story into the present day. And I think that, a lot of people, I think, find that so much, they have to take it in pieces. I myself planned on a couple days to see the space. It's definitely something we are thinking about online. And one of my goals as director is to think about the digital future, but also the digital present that is very much here. And so how do you represent that and that depth? And, these are different things moving through physically and the moving emotionally qualities. And we're really looking to capture both of those. But I think the museum does a wonderful job of revealing how those are joined together. Has good food too, so I'm looking forward to it being reopened to have some of that good food based on regional cuisines of African Americans.
It's fantastic. You did, and I think you just said this just so that our audience is aware that there is sort of an opportunity to be able to virtually visit the museum. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, there's going to be more to come, but please go to our website. There's a lot of resources there, including thinking about race, an important initiative we have that educators have found useful. So, there's a lot there to explore.
Great. Do you see, and this is kind of, I should probably rephrase the question so it doesn't sound quite so silly. There has to be intersection between your work as an editor, as a poet, a creator of anthologies, and then as a curator, director of a museum. Can you talk about where those similarities lie and where those connections are?
Yeah, I mean, for me, poetry is that kind of connection. It's a method of connecting. A metaphor is saying this thing is not just like this other thing, but it is. And they both coexist. And for me, as you can probably tell, I'm really invested in readers and visitors and their experience. And I don't believe that we collect these things, especially at somewhere like Schomburg, which is free and open to the public, and the Smithsonian, which is likewise. We don't collect them just for us. We collect them for you all. And the goal is to share this knowledge and to help shape that conversation. And I think the museum has done a wonderful job of situating that. And we were talking this morning, one of the things that is one of the more recent additions after they opened was the first picture, an earliest picture, I should say, of Harriet Tubman. And as a young person, and I think we might all be familiar with her slightly older and photos and representations. And to see her as a young abolitionist, that's the person who snuck back across the border and brought people over and saw visions and was really a commanding force. And you can see it in this portrait. There's something about seeing it. I had actually seen it in person before I saw it in the museum, but seeing it in the museum, just as powerful, unbelievable to see that image of this person who we might know and we might not know, but we know as soon as we see looking back at us. So there is that powerful quality of connection. And, that's a different kind of witnessing than poetry, but it's really related, I hope.
What does a day in your life look like then in balancing those things and home and family, like many of us are during a pandemic?
I mean, I try to sleep. I try to eat regular, it's like the things that everyone does. I don't, it's my life. So it's hard for me to say how to describe it. It would seem infinitely boring in the sense that there's lots of meetings and there's lots of talk. But there's also, I think, a way you have to preserve a little bit of time to dream and imagine, because I think being the director of a museum, like being a writer, requires you to think big. You're having to imagine a world anew, but also realized. Writing isn't just dreaming; it's also putting in the work, and it's editing and revising and all those things that aren't always as flashy, but more important even. And I think that's what a museum is. It's the guys, the security folks, it's the facilities who keep us together and safe, especially in these days. That's just as important to me, and part of my role as director, as thinking about, how are we going to imagine the digital, how are we going to embrace the future, how are we going to tell our story. And we're, for instance, having a show on Reconstruction for the fall, and that's one of the things I think will have some online presence. But it also is a story that resonates with now about politics and race and power, and questions of who can vote, who can belong. All these are questions that are still with us. And I think providing a long story of that is one of the goals of the museum.
So where do you find, inspiration or, motivation, or, the material from which you generate that kind of dream aspect to sustain your work?
I mean, I watch a lot of Bachelor and Bachelorette. They provide the right amount of distraction, but they are not poetic for me, at least. I really look to history, and I look to music. Those are some of my huge inspirations. If I'm thinking in big ways, I'm really interested in the history of music and the music of history, and those sort of how they combine. And I have long done that in my writing. And so, like I said before, my family is part musicians, part preachers, and somewhere in there is poetry. And that kind of musicality is central, and that's very much where I draw inspiration.
So what is on your playlist?
Oh, back when I didn't just like rent songs, is that what we do now? Like I used to have them on CDs. I recently moved, so I have CDs. It's like, what do I do with these discs? And I have all my records and all my dad's records. So I have many ways of playing them. Whether it's The Harder They Come that I listen to. I think I did a count, and it was 2 million times my father played that record. I love lots of different kinds of music. You heard I referenced a Neil Young song, but I also love reggae and hip hop, and all really music that does what it does, and isn't ashamed of it. I think that can be really powerful. As I was saying earlier, I got a little rock bass, and DJ Easy Rock over there from Joy and Pain, and I'll settle for that for an answer.
What are you reading these days? And I'm not going to ask you what's sitting on the side table, because we covered that.
Yeah, I'm reading a lot of different things. I love nonfiction, and I think that's what drew me to start writing it. As that's mainly what I read. I read poetry, of course, but really I'm reading just whatever is striking my fancy. And I was saying earlier, I was reading some Jill Lepore histories. I love, there's a book called, I'm going to space on the name of it. But Saidiya Hartman's book, Beautiful Lives, that's a beautiful book, which really tries to reimagine history and tell it from sort of, we were talking earlier about B-sides, and tell the story from, police records and this person, and sort of rethink, seemingly, quote, anonymous women's lives, and how these Black women really are the center of our imagining of, say, the Harlem Renaissance. And I think that's really powerful, and kept in mind, really, for me, when I was working on the anthology and trying to find people who spoke in that same way, but published maybe a book of poems that, 200 copies were printed, and 190 of them disappeared, so that's the kind of thing I was also very aware of.
A question from our audience over email. What advice do you have for people who would like to be writers or poets?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much to think about. First of all, I think you should, do it. Like, don't hesitate. One of the great things about poetry specifically and writing, I think in general, is you don't need that much. Used to need a pen and a piece of paper. Now you might have a device, though I think that there's something powerful about a notebook or even, writing on something physical. There's those wonderful Emily Dickinson poems that are sort of shaped, and are they poems or are they not, that she's writing on envelopes or any scrap of paper. And I tend to do that. If you could see my desk, it's just filled with scraps of paper and, a notebook or two. But sometimes now I have to write on my phone because if I was commuting back when I did that, that would be the easiest thing at hand. So however you're getting it down, I think is important. I think you also have to be really generous to that first draft and to that writer who's writing that. You have to just get it out. And sometimes I find people, especially when they're starting out, get too hypercritical early on. Save that critic, that demon editor, for a little bit later, but don't kick that demon editor out entirely. That you have to be not ruthless, because I think you should be a little kind, but also say, let's be honest. I knew that wasn't really working. Quite often, if people take a workshop, they're trying to smuggle in something they know doesn't work, and once it gets cut, they're like, yeah, I knew that wasn't quite working. But it helps to sometimes have either a workshop or a friend or, read to your dog, whomever, have that sounding board that helps just get it aloud. I remember when, we used to send in poems to magazines, say in typewritten form or, printed out form, but by mail. And as soon as you put it in the mailbox and walked away, you're like, I know what's wrong with that poem. It's like you might have edited it a million times, but it was that act of sending it into the world. So I think you have to get a little oxygen in there, let it breathe. Sometimes that means putting it away for a little while. But again, if you're starting out, write and write, edit and edit, read and read, and then share it when you feel comfortable, maybe like 5 minutes before you feel comfortable. Because sometimes if you wait for the perfect moment, no editor comes to your house and takes it out of your drawer. It's just not, or takes it off your computer. You have to have a level of, reading aloud. And I used to read at, it was sort of even before poetry slams, but open mics and things like that. And that really helped me as a writer.
Another question from our audience, and I think I have this right. It says, I'm just kind of an ordinary person who likes to write, but I don't feel like I have anything interesting to say. How do I go about finding my voice?
Yeah. I mean, the thing I would say, and this I believe quite strongly, is you already have your voice. We all have a voice in different ways. And I think it's really important I would even say we have many voices. Some are the voices of our parents, some are the voices, maybe it's the voice you have that's telling you you're just ordinary, but being ordinary is extraordinary. Everyone's unique, and I really believe that. And we need all the voices we can get, and we need yours, so I wouldn't be worried about subject. If you sit down and start writing every day, your subject will reveal itself. And the key is to know, what the difference between what Richard Hugo called the triggering subject and the real subject. I hope you may know Richard Hugo's The Triggering Town. If you don't, buy it, get it from your local library. It'll take you an hour to read it. And in it, he's really great about sort of getting rid of the things you shouldn't worry about and like focus on your pencils. Get your pencils sharpened and put them on this angle, because what he's trying to get us to think about is you have a particularity that you need to honor. And then once you sit down, he says, look over your shoulder. There's no one there. Keep going. And then I think, I myself think that's when your demon editor comes in as later. Don't worry about the subject. As I said before, I thought everyone had the same experience I had, and only when I started writing about it did I see the ways it was unique, the ways that it was mine, and the ways that I shared it with people and that people recognize themselves in it that I wouldn't have known. Some people, something like Seamus Heaney, who wrote about Ireland, he wasn't writing thinking of me, but I find his work talks to me intimately. And so one of the wonders of poetry is it's not just about transport, but it's also about time travel, and it's the most efficient way I know. And you can go to a place quite different in a poem. And the last thing I'll say is when you're writing, you have to also let yourself go to that other place. And Richard Hugo would call it the real subject. But as he says, you write trees on a piece of paper, you start writing a poem, and then you sort of run out of things to say. And so you start writing about more and more trees, but trees is not the subject. That's just the triggering subject. Your real subject might be, hope or pain. Not that you want to say my real subject is hope and pain, but you want to get at the other things that, are there in the world and that are just beneath these things that we imbue with meaning. You want to find a metaphor that's going to take us into myth and into selfhood and into the future.
Is it fair to say that a writer and the demon editor might have the same conversations over and over again?
Maybe. I mean, you find out your habits, right? I remember different times, I really worked on endings. And one of the hardest things to do when I was working on my third book, Jelly Roll, was to realize there were poems that were just existed for this little ending, and that they had to go, rather than try to work on them more to get them. And then there were poems that weren't as necessarily stellar in a weird way and weren't as gorgeous, but were doing something different. And that was more important in a weird way for this whole book. It's like an album, when we were talking about albums, you don't want to hear like fast, unless it's the Ramones or something, or a Public Enemy. You don't want to hear fast, 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 fast. You want to hear fast, fast, slow, a little bit, think of it as your evening out, you want to hear a mix of things. And it required that. And I think that's also more true to life. And a poem will sometimes insist on being more like life than it is like art.
I have one last question for you, and then I'm hoping that you would grant us the pleasure of one more poem before we close tonight. What event in history do you think should be taught more about in the mainstream? And some examples offered are Tulsa, Emmett Till, Green Book Travel Guide, or other.
Yes, I think all of these things are so important. The Tulsa Massacre, Greenville, we can go down lists. I think thinking about the ways that usurping of Black citizenship has occurred, I think are important. But I lived in Kansas in part. I think knowing about a place like Nicodemus, an all Black town, are just as important. We have to think about Black joy, Black resistance. I try to write about all these things. Sometimes they're intimately tied in one life. Someone like Hank Aaron, for instance, who just recently passed away. I have a poem to him. And what I was trying to capture in what I called an open letter, it's a poem, was to try to capture the ways that he persisted in this despite just reams and reams of bags and bags of hate mail. He saved it, and I think as a lesson for us, not for him. He didn't need to read it. We needed to read it and reckon with the fact of his breaking a record, somehow angering people to the point of death threats. And the way that he talked about it, he says after he hits his fateful home run, he says, "I just thank God it's over with," he says. In a way there was a kind of, but at the same time, he was such a fighter for justice. So I want to tell those complicated stories about achievement, but also about resistance. And, the green books, I think, are so important. And the reason there aren't that many left is because who keeps a travel guide? These were guides to the segregated South, but also for Black travelers. So, there's a terrific book called The Overground Railroad by Candace E. Taylor that you should absolutely read, that talks about them in depth. And one of the things she points out is the ways that the biggest number of sites in the Green Book are in Harlem, because they were for Black travelers. And there were places in Harlem longer than you might think that weren't available to Black people to stay at. So, we have a complicated history. Light is needed on all of these things. And the Green Books were one guide to that. Before I left Schaumburg, I curated a show on traveling while Black, and the Green Books were just one part of that. But they tell an important story of what they used to say, which is, we hope this book is no longer needed after a certain point. But while it is, we want it to be the best at doing it. And there were other guides we should know. And, the Green Book has become known, I think, because the New York Public Library digitized it and provided it. You can today see all the guides they own for free. And I think that's very important, because what we're talking about, and I think the questioner, because I think it's a smart question, I think we're talking about access to information, and I am a big believer in access. I have been fortunate to see into archives and go to archives, but not everyone is able to. So how do we both provide the access to the archives, sometimes from afar, but also to things that sometimes people used to get and never share or not catalog, so people could find out and discover. Discovery is a big part of it. But also just, how do we provide access to the past? And the museum, I think, does that so beautifully through its shows, through curation, through telling a story. And it's an American one. It's one we need to hear. And, it's also evolving in the sense that we're making new discoveries even now about the past. And so I'm just as interested in all the things asked about, which I think are very smart to know, and we should all know about, but also that there's the next thing we need to know about. And I'm eager to share those as they come to bear, like Harriet Tubman's photograph.
Thank you. Would you read one more poem for us before we go tonight?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real treat being with you in Spokane and beyond. I thought I'd read a poem from my latest book, which is called Brown. The title thinks about lots of different kinds of brownness. James Brownness, John Brown, who obviously lived in Kansas and was a figure in my childhood, but also sort of what it meant to be brown. This last poem in it, and I should say the centering poem, the title poem, takes place in Kansas because I lived there, and Linda Brown of Brown v. Board played piano in my church. She, of course, was the symbol at the center of that important case that desegregated, or started at least, the desegregation of our schools. And Reverend Brown had preached at this church. All that's to say, not important for this poem, which I'll read, but I think helps, think about the freight and history that this speaker talks about in this poem, which is called Hive, like a beehive. Hive. The honeybee's exile is almost complete. You can carry them from hive to hive, the child thought, and that is what he tried, walking with them, thronging between his pressed palms. Let him be right. Let the gods look away as always. Let this boy, who carries the entire actual whirring world in his calm, unwashed hands, barely walking, bear us all there, buzzing, unstung.
Thank you so much. That line let this boy lines, that let this boy who carries the entire actual whirring world in his calm, unwashed hands. Once I read that, it has not left me even for a moment. So thank you so much
Well,
for
thank
the
you.
poem and for being with us today. Genuinely appreciate it. I know our audience does. And thank you to our audience for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. See you soon. I'm going to sign off, Gwendolyn.
That sounds good. We just have to end the live video.